Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the very first Watchman Newscast live stream of 2022. Wow, happy new year to everyone. It's great to have you with us in this new year, and it will be a very eventful year, I believe, when it comes to global affairs. Let's just say that, in particular, in the world's most volatile and strategic region, the Middle East, which is what we focus on most of the time here on the newscast. The Middle East never sleeps, and 2022 will be no exception. What happens in the Middle East will not stay in the Middle East. And we're seeing, and another example of that today, what we want to start out talking about today is this onslaught. I don't think it's exaggeration to use that word, of Iranian-backed militias targeting U.S. troops in Iraq and now in Syria as well. Three times today alone, folks. U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria were targeted. Of course, that comes on the heels of attempted attacks Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So this is becoming an everyday occurrence now, and it all revolves around, or all coincides with, the 2-year anniversary of the death of terror master. That's right, terror master Qassem Soleimani. Some people didn't like me using that term. Some, I guess, fans of Qassem Soleimani who were kind of trolling the channel and watching and said, how dare you call Qassem Soleimani a terror master? I'll go one further. He was the most dangerous terrorist in the world at the time of his death. I will lay out why exactly he was and why it was probably a very wise decision that saved lives, countless American lives and Muslim lives in the Middle East, to see Soleimani eliminated, the not so dearly departed terror master. We'll talk about that and how this uptick in attacks obviously is revolving around the 2-year anniversary of his death. But folks, it's deeper than that. There is a larger strategy at play here by the Iranian regime, and we'll talk about that as well. Let's just check in with everyone right now. We have people from around the world. South Africa, I see, joining us, and then Kentucky. From South Africa to the Wildcats of Kentucky. This is great. Arkansas. We have usually every week Ireland and Norway and China, all over the place. They're watching. Qatar. We have some people from Qatar right now, which is awesome. Be sure to send in your questions. Our trusty producer, Daniel, will be taking them. We're going to finish out today, as we always do here on the live streams, with a Q&A session. Ask me anything prophetic. Someone watching from Pakistan right now. God bless you. Australia. Hey, the south side of Chicago as well. Your Bulls are looking pretty good right now. DeMar DeRozan tearing it up. So it's great to have everyone with us. Nigeria, Maine, Ohio, Qatar again, South Carolina. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. God bless you all. Happy New Year to everyone. And I love giving everyone a shout out here around the world. Number one, because we love and appreciate you guys. We love and appreciate our viewers from around the world. We can't do what we do without everyone watching. First of all, without God Almighty. He's given us this mandate. He has given us this platform. I like to say that I serve at the pleasure, or I work at the pleasure of the King, King Jesus. And that's why we do and how we do what we do. Secondly, of course, God has blessed us with hundreds of thousands of watchmen and women on the wall for such a time as this, 2022, right here on the news channel, right here on the live stream. It's kind of a family here. And I compare our Watchmen subscribers to the men of Issachar, the sons of Issachar. First Chronicles talks about that elite group of 200 men who surrounded King David. They knew the signs, they knew the times, and they knew what Israel should do about it. That's how the Bible describes the sons of Issachar. I think we've got hundreds of thousands of sons and daughters of Issachar with us here on the Watchmen News channel. Hey, we're about to hit 413,000 subscribers, a crazy number to start 2022 with. We ended 2020 with about, I think, 150,000. So tremendous growth in the past year alone. To God be the glory, of course, and a big shout out to everyone watching. Okay, hello, Philippines, Nairobi, Kenya. This is great. breaking news that we want to start with that, folks, the mainstream media has largely been ignoring this. Yes, there's been items in different mainstream media publications about what's going on here. Maybe a short report on television on the mainstream media outlets, but no great in-depth analysis in terms of the larger picture of this wave of Iranian-backed attacks against American soldiers this week. This is a major story. 3 times today alone, Wednesday, January 5th, U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria were targeted by what the U.S.-led coalition called Iranian-backed attacks. If Iran's forces, if its minions are attacking U.S. forces at the behest of the Iranian regime, then why, oh why, are U.S. diplomats still in Vienna and conducting the charade of nuclear talks with the Iranian regime? We'll talk about that. First, to give you the up-to-date breakdown, just reading directly here from a report that just came over the wire shortly ago. Military bases housing U.S. forces attacked in Syria and Iraq. Folks, I'm American. Of course, I live in the United States, but we have many, many viewers who do not. Still, this affects you again. Number one, because the U.S., whether you like us or not, is still the world's most influential and powerful country. Number two, and I don't say that in a braggadocious way, I'm just stating a fact. The U.S. is still a superpower, although we certainly, under the current leadership, see signs of slippage and cracking internally, to say the least. I know that. Believe me, I fully realize that. But just stating a fact, the United States still, as we begin 2022, remains the world's most powerful country. So anything that happens regarding this nation, clearly major events, if this nation's at war or being attacked, it has global repercussions. That's number one. Number two, especially if it happens in the world's most volatile, most strategic, most chaotic, most pivotal region, the Middle East. So I will read on here. Military bases, U.S.-led coalition forces responded with artillery fire in Syria. Let's dig into it. Rockets and indirect fire struck bases hosting U.S.-led military coalition forces in Iraq and Syria in at least 3 separate attacks Wednesday. That's today, January 5th. It was the 3rd day in a row that Iran-aligned paramilitary groups have targeted America and its partners in the Middle East. Now, we also talked about this on yesterday's newscast. You can check it out here in our archives. Hey, by the way, I usually assume if you're joining us for the live stream, you've probably subscribed, but maybe you haven't. If you haven't, give us a subscribe and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time we post these updates. We are posting them every single day, by the way, sometimes on weekends as well, depending on the news. More on these attacks today and over the past few days. The latest spate of attacks started on Monday as these Iran-backed militias marked the 2nd anniversary of the American strike that killed senior Iranian General Qassem Soleimani. I'm looking down, by the way, because I'm reading this directly from a report right off of my phone, so don't mind that. None of the attacks have caused any casualties or major damage, but the persistence of the rocket and drone attacks raises the risk of a broader conflict. What have we been saying here, folks, over the past few weeks here on the newscast? Major General John W. Brennan Jr., the commander of the U.S.-led military coalition in Iraq and Syria, said the coalition reserves the right to defend itself and partner forces against any threat. Okay. The 3 attacks today, let's run them down. Number one, in Syria, a small military base in northeastern Syria hosting U.S.-backed Syrian and coalition forces came under 8 rounds of indirect fire, causing minor damage within the base, but no casualties. According to the coalition, they responded with 6 rounds of artillery fire against these Iranian-backed positions, I presume. The coalition blamed the attack on the base in Syria, which is known as Green Village, on Iran-supported malign actors. That was only the beginning today. The attacks against U.S. soldiers in eastern Syria, right near the Iraq border, the Syria-Iraq border. We also had a rocket fired at Baghdad International Airport, which houses U.S. troops in a wing of the airport. And then we had 6 rockets fired at Ain al-Assad base in western Iraq in Anbar province. We're not sure yet. I'm looking at the latest there. 5 rockets, correct me. Later on Wednesday, that's today, 5 rockets fired in the vicinity of Ain al-Assad, an Iraqi military base that hosts U.S. forces. According to the coalition and Iraqi security forces, 5 rockets. They landed far from the base, thankfully, with the nearest impact being a bit over 1 mile from the base. A militia calling itself Saraya Qassem al-Jabarin. Whew. I think they're Irish. I'm not sure. Just kidding. Claimed responsibility for the attack near Ain al-Assad in a statement on Wednesday night. It's an Iran-backed militia. Surprise, surprise. So let's break it down. 2 attacks today, 2 rocket attacks against U.S. bases which house U.S. soldiers in Iraq. That's number 1. Number 2, in Syria, shelling. Now, this kind of drifts away a bit from what had been the MO of these Iran-backed militias over the past few months, drones. But never fear. The drone attacks came Monday and Tuesday, attempted drone attacks, 2 of them in Iraq. Number 1 against Baghdad International Airport, number 2 against Ain al-Assad Air Base. They were both targeted by these Iran-backed militias on Monday and Tuesday. In each incident, 2 explosive-packed drones attempted to fly into these bases and detonate and cause carnage. Thankfully, all 4 of these drones in these 2 separate incidents were shot down. Now, it's interesting because today, on the heels of the failed drone attacks on Monday and Tuesday against Ain al-Assad base that's in western Iraq, in Anbar province, near the Syrian border, and then obviously at Baghdad International Airport, drones were used. Today, Wednesday, those same bases were attacked again, as I just read off to you. But in this case, rockets were used. Now, these Iranian-backed militias today went back to their old standby. Remember, before roughly, I'd say last winter, 2021, the MO for these Iranian-backed militias was rockets, constantly barrages of rockets, maybe not constantly, but let's say frequently, targeting U.S. personnel, bases where U.S. troops were stationed in Iraq. It had become a fairly regular occurrence. Rockets were the weapon of choice for these militias. It then shifted noticeably to drones. Think back to October. We reported here in the newscast at the Al-Tanf base in Syria, also in the eastern half of Syria near the Syria-Jordan border, very remote area where you have U.S. troops based there in Syria. There were 5 drones, 5 explosive-laden drones sent against that base. Thankfully, that attack was successful, but it had become a drone thing. To put it bluntly, and now the drones failed on Monday and Tuesday, and now rockets were used today. Interesting. I just bring that up to say, okay, maybe the Iranian regime, its militias are saying the drones didn't have the effectiveness that we wanted. Rockets perhaps are harder to shoot down, and maybe they'll be more effective. You would think in some ways a drone may be harder to shoot down. I am not a military strategist, by the way, just saying in layman's terms, drones are small, a smaller target, perhaps harder to shoot down. Any of our military men out there, God bless you and thank you, first of all. Second of all, what do you think? Comment here in our chat, which is lively. I see it right now. Any of our military vets, what do you think would be harder to shoot down, a rocket or a drone? I may sound like a dummy even asking that question, but I want to be accurate. I don't want to speak out of turn about something I'm not an expert in. So let us know what you think. I'd love to see that. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A as well. At any rate, Iran used rockets today against the same bases that it failed with drones on Monday and Tuesday. I just think that's interesting. And Ain al-Assad base and the Baghdad International Airport base continue to be steady targets for the Iranian regime and those militias. We're going to zoom out now, more big picture. Why is this happening? How, when, and if will the U.S. retaliate? Real quick, just to remind you, we have right now about 2,500 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Some people have asked that, well, who do we have? Who's in Iraq still? I thought we were out of there. Still 2,500 soldiers left, American soldiers working with that coalition. And U.S. officials, I should say coalition officials mainly, they go to great pains to say, we are here because of ISIS. Remember, the U.S. re-entered Iraq in 2014, 2015 to crush ISIS, which President Trump did accomplish. He kept his promise. No matter what you think of President Trump, he certainly, in the case of ISIS, kept his promise and then some, smashed that caliphate. So that did happen. The U.S. stayed, and now there are 2,500 U.S. soldiers still in Iraq. They keep saying we're here for ISIS. But folks, let's face it, the Iranian regime, ISIS, still a threat, but definitely severely weakened by President Trump's strong actions in Iraq. And the greater threat clearly in Iraq, in Syria, in the region right now is the Iranian regime and its proxies. That's pretty clear. So the coalition can talk all about being there to fight ISIS, but let's face it, the main threat is Iran. Clearly, even when ISIS was at its apex, Iran was still the biggest threat in the region. But those 2,500, their combat role has ended. That means they are now officially there in a, quote, advisory role. So they're not supposed to be engaging in combat right now. Will they be forced to engage in combat thanks to this steady stream every day now of rockets and drones and shelling and artillery fire coming from Iran and these Iranian-backed militias? These troops in Iraq may have no choice, not to mention the U.S. soldiers in Syria. 900 U.S. soldiers in Syria, also in this quote unquote advisory role. And look, I don't want to say sitting ducks because they have plenty of equipment, they're armed, and they can defend themselves, but severely outnumbered when you think of the numbers, the sheer numbers of Iranian-backed militias which operate in the region. So clearly a major threat. Zooming out and taking a broader view, this all comes obviously against the backdrop of the 2-year anniversary of the death of terror master Qassem Soleimani. Now, the Iranian regime, it's been quite a sight over the past few days, folks. Have you been watching this? We had some of the footage on Monday and Tuesday's newscasts. It's been stunning. They almost deify Qassem Soleimani. It's fascinating to watch in a chilling way, but that has been standard for the Iranian regime and Hezbollah over the years. The so-called martyrs, terrorists who die in the defense or in the service of the Iranian regime and the cause of jihad, are lionized and almost deified. Again, in Iran, in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, you have these massive murals, you have statues of these figures, including Soleimani, where these were, I would say, emotional, to say the least, remembrances of Soleimani, not only in Iran on Monday. Remember, it was January 3rd, 2020, 2 years ago, when President Trump ordered the drone strike that eliminated Qassem Soleimani and also the leader of the kind of the umbrella group of those Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq, al-Muhandis, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He and Soleimani, two very big fish, of course, both eliminated in that one strike. So al-Muhandis was also lionized. But in Iran, in the Shia areas of Iraq, which are essentially controlled by Iran, in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah country, in Gaza, where Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Iran's two proxies there, operate, and most likely among the Houthis in Yemen too. Soleimani, it was the order of the day. His memory that he's a lion of jihad and revenge was uttered, was threatened by various terror leaders, including The president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, clearly they have not gotten over the death of Soleimani 2 years ago, and they're still breathing threats of revenge. Raisi, and we talked about this on Monday's newscast, it got a chuckle from a lot of people in our comments, but it tells you where Iran is coming from. Raisi said, unless President Trump is put on trial, then we are going to seek revenge, and he directly threatened the United States. Now, President Trump's not going to be put on trial for the death of Qassem Soleimani anytime soon, but it shows you the radical, for an Iranian leader to say this publicly, and for the entire Khamenei, the supreme leader, who's the ultimate authority in that country. And Raisi, by the way, doesn't say anything without the blessing and approval of the supreme leader. For them to say this publicly and to publicly threaten the United States with, quote, revenge, shows you what you are dealing with, folks, not only in Vienna at the negotiating table, more on that in a minute, but in general. This is a radical genocidal regime. Where else in the world do you find a regime threatening to destroy another country, Israel, in the case of Iran, threatening to put world leaders, national leaders like President Trump, former national leader, on trial? Where else do you see that but in the Iranian regime? That's only the beginning of the insane, erratic, radical behavior. But they want President Trump put on trial. They say if he is not, they will bring America to justice one way or the other. This is Ibrahim Raisi, the man known as the Butcher of Tehran, by the way, in this nationally televised speech on Iranian state TV that he gave on Monday, commemorating the 2-year anniversary of the death of, again, the not so dearly departed terror kingpin, Qassem Soleimani. I mentioned at the top, some people said, well, how could you call him a terror master? Soleimani was fighting ISIS. Yes, Soleimani and the Iranian regime were fighting ISIS, not because they liked the United States, and not because Soleimani and the Iranian regime were any less evil or jihadist than ISIS. This was a battle simply for jihadi supremacy. They both want the same thing. Yes, there are clearly theological, ideological differences between Sunni jihadis in ISIS and the Shia jihadis in Iran. We know that. But at the end of the day, they wanted the same thing, essentially: regional domination, ultimately global domination, the revival of a caliphate, the destruction of Israel, the removal of America from the Middle East and from the world, for that matter. So similar goals, just a different way of going about it, number one. And number two, obviously, theological differences there between Sunni, Shia. That's why they were fighting. Qassem Soleimani and the Iranian regime weren't fighting ISIS because Soleimani and Iran were the good guys, or they'd suddenly change their spots and become anti-jihad, anti-butchery, anti-terrorism. It's not why they were fighting them. They were fighting them because both sides were vying for supremacy. And the Iranian regime ultimately won out, not because of some incredible, direct, massive effort by Soleimani and those Iran-backed militias who did fight ISIS and inflicted damage on ISIS for sure. But let's be honest here, all you Soleimani fans out there, the United States, the US-led coalition, and the Kurds did the bulk of the damage against ISIS and were the overwhelming force that crushed the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Let's be honest. Let's put all the cards on the table. But that is the crux of the Qassem Soleimani offensive against ISIS that people are trying to defend him for, which is insane. You know, I quoted from Proverbs the other day that said, when the wicked perish, I believe it was Proverbs chapter 11, verse 10, when the wicked perish, the people rejoice. So needless to say, I was not shedding any tears when Qassem Soleimani was dead and gone. And I believe it was the correct move by President Trump. And I believe that first and foremost because, according to U.S. officials at the time, Qassem Soleimani, who again landed in Iraq at Baghdad International Airport, according to U.S. officials, he had more death and destruction planned. I said at the top of this live stream that The United States saved countless lives, not only American lives, but Muslim lives in the Middle East with the removal of Qassem Soleimani. And to give you an idea of what he was all about, why I'm calling him a terror master, a terror kingpin, number one, Qassem Soleimani was directly behind the murder of hundreds, at least, of U.S. soldiers in Iraq, working through those Iranian-backed militias based in Iraq through improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and other means. Soleimani helped engineer the death of hundreds of U.S. troops. The Iranian regime doesn't even try to hide that. So he's a man with American blood on his hands, lots of American blood on his hands. Number two, he was the architect of Iran's strategy in the region to basically control Arab capitals. The Persians in Iran are controlling Arab capitals in Sana'a, Yemen, in Beirut, Lebanon, in Damascus, Syria, and in Baghdad, Iraq, not to mention the influence they have in Gaza. So that was also part of Soleimani's strategy, to make these nations and the Gaza Strip basically Iranian satellites. And number three, to surround Israel with that ring of fire, rockets, missiles, and drones that we've talked a lot about. And number four, I'll just throw in there, he was also in charge as the leader of the Quds Force, a wing of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Soleimani was also in charge of Iran's external terror operations. So when we around the world, so when we talk about embassies and consulates and different civilian targets, softer targets being targeted with terror, Soleimani was intimately involved in all of that, folks. Loads of innocent blood on his hands. Without a doubt, this is the real Qassem Soleimani. I guess it depends on where you're sitting, though, right? Among the Iranian regime, not the average Iranian person, by the way. There are many Iranians on the ground in that country who loathe the likes of Soleimani and the regime. They are the main victims of this wicked regime in Tehran. Again, it's not the Iranian people we're talking about. We're talking about the regime that is actively suppressing its own people, including the growing Christian population in Iran. Just something to mention there, reportedly some 1 million followers of Jesus in that country right now, despite horrific persecution and repression and threats by the regime. Hey, you can't stop the gospel, folks. And even in Iran, one of the hardest places to penetrate with the word of the Lord, the ranks of followers of Jesus are growing, mostly in underground churches. We've reported on this on TBN, on the Watchman Newscast, on the Watchman TV show as well. It is an exciting story. And if we want Iran to turn around and shed this regime, I think we all do, we'd like to see a new day, needless to say, for the leadership in Iran. Maybe that's one thing that could help turn the tide, the fervent prayers of righteous men and women inside Iran, which will certainly avail much in turning that country around. Our prayers are with the people of Iran, and this regime has caused a lot of damage over the past, now going on 43 years, with a great, proud nation, Iran. Think of ancient Persia. This is a Bible land, ladies and gentlemen. Think of Esther, think of Mordecai, think of Cyrus. These are figures from ancient Persia, modern day Iran in your Bible. Think of that. So this is an ancient Bible land. And I don't believe God's done with that land. And I really have the people of Iran. I know so many great Iranians. There's a pretty sizable Iranian population here in the United States where I live. If you're watching, you probably have some Iranian friends. There's a good chance. And certainly in the work I do over the years, many Iranian dissidents I've been proud to call friends who just vehemently oppose, for good reason, this regime and all the evil it's engaging in and bringing misery not only to the people of Iran, but wherever they go. Those satellites I mentioned, I call them satellite nations of the Iranian regime. Look at Yemen. Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. Look at Lebanon. Look at Gaza. What do all five have in common, other than the fact, of course, these are Muslim nations and a Muslim area in Gaza? The other thing they have in common is the people are living in misery, chaos, in most cases, poverty. And the last thing they have in common, Iran. is the main power broker in all of those nations. Do you see a pattern here? Wherever this regime goes, it brings misery, chaos, poverty, and discord. And that's the truth. And that's how we have to call it here. And we're going to tell it like it is. This is no time to mince words. We say never hold your peace at the end of every Watchman newscast. And that's what we're talking about. When we see evil, we're going to call it out. You know, Ezekiel 33 talks about, and I'm paraphrasing, if the watchman or woman does not sound the alarm, if they hold their peace, then he or she will be held accountable. When you see a great evil gathering, I believe we have a duty, a sacred duty as followers of Jesus, to be salt and light, number one, but to speak truth to power, speak truth to evil, I should say, in this case, and be voices for moral clarity. In these morally relative times, we need to be voices for moral clarity. Again, salt and light in the darkness. That's what we aim to do here on the Watchman newscast. What will the U.S. retaliation be? Wow, you know what? We're moving fast here. We will get to questions in a few minutes. So be sure to send those questions along. We are moving fast here. It's looking good. We have just a quick shout out as I take a breather here. A lot of talking over an hour. Send the questions, and we have people again from all over the world writing in. This is great. We have thousands of people with us right now. So this is a lot of fun. Welcome everyone from around the world. Send those questions. This is great. Okay, how will the U.S. at all retaliate? Why is Iran doing this? The easy answer, let's talk about that first. The easy answer is Qassem Soleimani. We are seeking revenge for the death of Qassem Soleimani, so we're striking at the United States in Iraq and Syria. That's the obvious answer, and certainly that's a big part of it. Secondly, the Iranian regime wants to push the United States out of the Middle East altogether. Now, if you're watching, you might be saying, good. If you're an American, you might say, good, let's get out of there for good. We want to be out of the Middle East. We shouldn't be there anyway. A lot of people said the same thing about Afghanistan. Whatever you feel on that, that's a conversation for another time. But for now, the fact is Iran wants us out. Whether you think we should be out or we should stay, okay. The bottom line is same with Afghanistan. The bottom line is whether you thought we should stay, we should leave, the way it was done was an absolute debacle by the Biden administration. And that ain't good. And in Iraq, we have to watch that as well. Iran, just as the Taliban and ISIS and different jihadis in Afghanistan did, Iran is feeling the Afghanistan effect. They took notes. They saw what went down there. And they're saying, okay, let's push the U.S. out with its tail between its legs, or at least give that impression, out of Iraq. So we have to keep a very close eye on this, folks, because if attacks increase 3 days in a row now against U.S. soldiers, there's only not even 4,000 of them spread out across Iraq and Syria. God forbid a U.S. soldier or soldiers are killed in these attacks in Iraq and Syria. And again, God forbid, and we pray God's hand of protection over those brave men and women as an American defending my rights, my freedoms here. But if, God forbid, there are injuries or deaths, how will the Biden administration react? Will there be a hasty withdrawal where it looks like Iran carried out attacks, Americans were injured, killed, again, God forbid, and now America is retreating? That's not a good look at all. It was a bad look in Afghanistan for the United States. It would be a bad look in Iraq. But I can tell you right now, the Iranian regime, in what they're doing these past few days, yes, it's about Soleimani, but secondly, certainly it's about the larger goal to push America out of the Middle East altogether. Think about it, folks. And by the way, to put a further dent in U.S. prestige, think about it. All that stands between Iran and Israel, essentially, is the United States. 900 U.S. soldiers in eastern Syria and 2,500 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. If those U.S. soldiers were gone, Iran would feel even more emboldened, even more empowered to continue to build and pursue that land bridge from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. That's the ultimate goal. Don't forget the land bridge. Iran's been wanting to form that for decades. Now they have a golden opportunity. In a sense, those U.S. soldiers do stand in the way, although, of course, Iran has still been able to maneuver and essentially establish that land bridge when you think about it. But certainly they'd like to see the U.S. leave so they could have more free reign, number one, and number two, to embarrass America. As simple as that, and duplicate what happened in Afghanistan. So that's a second overriding reason for these attacks the past few days. The third reason is, drumroll please, those nuclear talks in Vienna. The Iranian regime is attempting to build leverage. What do I mean? Well, real simple. Have you ever heard the term blackmail? Maybe the term extortion? This regime, they are masters at it, and they are saying right now, they're not saying it out loud, but they're showing it through their actions in Iraq and Syria. They're saying to the United States indirectly, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to cause a lot of trouble for you. First and foremost, in Iraq and Syria. Drop the sanctions, great Satan, as they call the United States. Drop the sanctions. Drop all sanctions against us. Allow us to sell oil and reap all the profits, or else we will target U.S. soldiers. We will continue to target U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria. That's the game Iran's playing. It's very, very clear. Their take right now, usually you would think, okay, this seems to be the strategy, especially with Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, who's responsible for the deaths of countless untold numbers of Iranian dissidents when he worked in Iran's judiciary, sentenced them to death. A sick man, to say the least. Under the leadership of Raisi, we have the most radical Iranian regime ever since 1979. And folks, that is saying something. He's very close to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. There's no ideological daylight among the upper echelon of the Iranian regime right now. Not that there was ever a massive amount of daylight. Moderation in this regime is all relative. Speaking of relativism, I guess you would say, but certainly you don't have anyone who would remotely be called by the mainstream media a moderate in this current Iranian regime. This is the hard line of hard line. Considering that, the tack they're going to take in approaching world powers in Vienna is not what you might expect. You might expect for a normal, rational regime, and not that Iran's not rational in its own evil way. Believe me, they're calculated, they're patient, they're cunning, the Iranian leadership. But you would think they might try to behave themselves. Maybe they'll be on their best behavior and then go to the negotiating table in Vienna and get what they want. That's what happened in 2013, 2014, 2015 under the previous Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, who was essentially the face of the regime and the mouthpiece, along with Javad Zarif, the former Iranian foreign minister. So their tack was, okay, we will talk to the West and we will be reasonably polite, although it was interesting to read reports of Zarif screaming at John Kerry, the former U.S. Secretary of State. Why am I not surprised by that during their meetings in previous years? But the tack generally was, okay, we will feign moderation, and then maybe we'll get what we want. Guess what? They got the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Rouhani was painted by the mainstream media, by Democrats, by international diplomats, by the UN as a great moderate. Hassan Rouhani was no moderate, folks, to say the least. But that was the mantle he was given. Why? Why was he propped up as this great new voice of moderation? Because the left wanted that Iran nuclear deal, and the quote unquote international community wanted that Iran deal so badly that they had to prop someone up and say, look, he's moderate. Remember, Hassan Rouhani followed Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So it was going to be very tough to strike a nuclear deal with Ahmadinejad, who would be right at home in this current Iranian regime. But Rouhani was the smiling, gentler face, again, according to the mainstream media and world diplomats in Brussels and in DC, et cetera, et cetera. Rouhani is our man, they said, and we can make it work with him. We can go to the world and say, we've got this deal. Look, Rouhani's not crazy. He's moderate. And again, a guy who's anything but moderate, every bit vociferously anti-American, anti-Israel, genocidal as the rest of the regime. But he smiled in front of the cameras instead of scowling. And the Obama administration bought it and they sold it. They sold Rouhani as the man, just as the left continues to paint Mahmoud Abbas as a great moderate. Hey, if they want their plan to succeed, the two-state solution, they need someone. Abbas is a moderate. He's moderate relative to Hamas, but Abbas is no moderate, folks. This is a man who continues to pay the salaries of terrorists. I won't get into it again. We've talked about it on previous live streams over the past few weeks, but Mahmoud Abbas helps pay the salaries in what's been called the Pay for Slay program, helps give lifetime, or not helps give, gives lifetime stipends, lifetime salaries to the families of terrorists who kill men, women, and children, including Americans. Check out our previous live streams. We talked about it in particular. Gosh, was it last week, the week before? Check it out in our archives. It's around. I can't keep track of all the dates. All I know is this is 2022. It's our first live stream of 2022. But Pay for Slay, you can do an internet search, do Watchman Pay for Slay. I've reported on it. You can check that out. So Raisi's tack is interesting. And we're getting into questions literally in 1 minute. Let me just finish this thought and take a sip of water. In Philadelphia, we say water. You say water. But I learned when I left Philadelphia, where all we say is water, the rest of the world says water. Very interesting. So on TV, I have to clean it up once in a while. But when I'm sitting here, I can just say that was water that I just sipped from. And you guys can have fun with that in the chat. I know the Philly accent is very unique. But Raisi's take, or his strategy, seems to be the opposite of the Rouhani strategy. He's not going to smile for the cameras. He's not going to glad hand with Western diplomats and try to be friends. No. Now Iran is taking an aggressive stance. And they're not saying, hey, let's make nice. We're more moderate. Now, look, Rouhani, he's reasonable. Look, Javad Zarif, he's reasonable. No. Now it's give us what we want or we will hurt you. That's the strategy of Raisi. It's pretty clear right now. Folks, as U.S. troops are being attacked by Iran-backed and supported forces every day this week so far, including 3 times today alone in Iraq and Syria. At the same time, Iranian diplomats are meeting with U.S. diplomats, indirectly meeting with them in Vienna over Iran's nuclear program. This is madness from a Western perspective. Number one, the talks should have never been revived in the first place. We've covered that ground here on the newscast. But number two, once your nation is under attack by your negotiating partner, at the same time that you're negotiating in Vienna, you should probably get up from the negotiating table, push your chair out, and go home and say, we're out of here. Talks are over. Stop targeting our troops in Syria and Iraq. But that hasn't happened. And I'm not sure that it will happen. The big question here is, will the Biden administration retaliate? 3 days in a row, U.S. soldiers targeted by Iran, militias acting at the behest of Iran. Clearly, the coalition spokesman said that today. What will the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, I laugh when I say that, what will he do? Now, back in February 2021, late February, and then again in late June, President Biden ordered airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias along the Syria-Iraq border because they were attacking U.S. bases where U.S. troops are stationed in Iraq and Syria. Now we have it again. And now it's an escalation, folks, because it's 3 days in a row and multiple attacks in one day today. There has to be a U.S. response, or so you would think. Will it be some airstrikes along the Iraq-Syria border, which clearly didn't have much of an effect because they're still at it, meaning Iran and its proxies? What would really send a message would be to kill these nuclear talks. What will the response be? You would think there has to be some kind of response, right? Or these attacks will continue. Apparently, they'll continue even if there is a response. It depends on the level of the response. President Trump's response was to eliminate Qassem Soleimani, the second most powerful man in the Iranian regime, next to the supreme leader. That sent a message that Iran still has not recovered from, and they will never fully recover from the loss of Soleimani. He was irreplaceable in that regime, so central to their plans, their strategy. What will the response be? Will there be a response? We're waiting. Let's see what goes down here and what it's going to be. In the meantime, question time. Let's see. Hey, did we have anyone write in about the question earlier about, I probably against like a dummy asking, but I'm not a military man. Like, we have some awesome veterans who I love, who obviously follow us. We love and appreciate you guys. Pray for you every single day with my family, my daughters. Every day we pray for you. What's easier to shoot down? Would it be the drone or the rocket? Might be forgive me if it sounds dumb, but I want to know. I want to know what would be easier, because Iran's been using, they've been using rockets, Iran and those militias, for years in Iraq. Then they switched to drones, and today it's back to rockets. I don't know. Just think it's interesting. Is there a reason for that? Let's see some questions here. Here's a simple one to start off with, and Daniel has some questions for us as well, our producer. Do you think, this is an easy one, do you think these attacks will escalate? I think there's a good chance they will. These attacks, he means in Iraq and Syria, the questioner, unless there is some, well, a few things. Number one, unless there is some sort of U.S. response, some sort of meaningful response. I'm not saying a massive bombing campaign, but something pinpoint and strategic and effective that sends a message to the Iranian regime and these militias. That's number one. That could dampen Iran's enthusiasm for these strikes against U.S. assets in the Middle East. Number two, what does Iran want to accomplish ultimately with these strikes? I just laid out what I think. Yes, revenge for Soleimani is one part of it, but I think that's being used as the pretext. Revenge for Soleimani, of course, the 2-year anniversary of his death is upon us. But I think the larger game here is to hasten the U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East and push the U.S. out. And number two, gain leverage at the negotiating table. That's the bigger game here. So do U.S. diplomats, and again, U.S. diplomats, to give you an idea of how ineffectual these talks are in Vienna, U.S. diplomats are not meeting face-to-face with their Iranian counterparts. Oh, no, they're in a separate room. These are indirect negotiations on the demand of the Iranian regime. Iranian diplomats said, we will not share a room with the United States, with representatives of the nation we call the Great Satan. So Iranian diplomats are meeting face-to-face with Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia, and the U.S. is in the other room. That's a flawed strategy. I don't know if strategy is the word, but a flawed setup, I guess you would say, to start with, right? That U.S. diplomats aren't even in the same room as their Iranian counterparts. But there's a good chance these will continue, these attacks. It depends on what I just laid out above, and this could escalate. It could escalate. I can tell you the United States does not want to escalate. One of the reasons you're likely not going to see a forceful, meaningful response that would really have a long-term effect from the Biden administration is Joe Biden is hell-bent on reviving that disastrous Iran nuclear deal. I mean, they want it bad because they want this to go away. They're thinking, okay, if we give Iran what it wants, we can kind of check this box and say, okay, the Iran problem is taken care of, at least for a few years. They'll be good, and it kicks the can down the road. And yeah, they'll go nuclear eventually, but not on our watch. In 5 years, they will, but not on our watch. Sad, very sad. and talk about moral relativism and a lack of moral clarity. But that's the thinking right now in Washington, D.C. By the way, Daniel writes in, people are saying drones would be harder to shoot down because they can move with more controls, where rockets are usually on a fixed path. Wow, very interesting. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Drones, again, they are essentially remote controlled, so they can move around, and rockets on a straight fixed path. Good stuff. Thanks for everyone for contributing and writing in there. We appreciate it big time. Let's see. What do we have here? Eric. Oh, this is a good one. I just talked about this on TBN today in one of my reports. Eric, what do you make of the recent supposed missile strike from North Korea this week? Remember them? Are they going to be involved with China and Taiwan? Wow, good question by Matt Seidel. Thanks, Matt. I've been wanting to talk about North Korea. We've been talking a lot, obviously, about Iran and its proxies, China, Russia, of course, and North Korea, which is historically, needless to say, a major global hotspot and a major troublemaker on the world stage, been kind of quiet, right, in the past few months. Today, once again, a coming out for Kim Jong-un. North Korea fired a ballistic missile into the sea, a ballistic missile test. I believe that was, he has done, I saw the numbers this morning. Now, since Kim Jong-un came to power in 2012, he has conducted 6 nuclear tests and some 62 ballistic missile tests. Wow. Things have not been quiet on the Korean Peninsula since Kim Jong-un came to power a decade ago now, 2012. Now it is 2022. This was troubling to me because, again, we've been so focused on Russia and China and Iran. Number one, Russia with 100,000 troops massed on its border with Ukraine right now. Possible invasion coming in 2022. Number two, China escalating its threats against Taiwan. After those Beijing Olympics in February, all bets are off when it comes to China and Taiwan. And number three, of course, the Iran nuclear crisis and Iran arming its proxies and the possibility of Israel taking out Iran's nuclear installations. All of this could come to a head in 2022. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. Today, folks, on the global stage and in particular in the Middle East, expect the unexpected. I will say that to you. And far too often, people say 9/11 happened because of a lack of imagination on the part of Western leaders and Western decision makers and experts. Very true. We could never picture people taking planes, flying them into buildings. Apparently, some could never conceive of such a scenario. Well, there are scenarios unfolding right now around the world that seem crazy. It'll never happen, but they might just happen. And 2022, I believe, especially the second half of 2022, is going to be eventful. I pray that it's not eventful in a bad way, but I'm also realistic, and I know the word of God, and I know prophecy, and I know things are heating up, and I believe time is short. North Korea is another player in all of this. I don't want to say a client state of China to the question from Matt Seidel. I don't want to say a client state of China. Certainly, China is North Korea's protector. If it wasn't for the communist regime in Beijing, the regime in Pyongyang would have been gone. A good chance they would have been gone long ago. But Kim Jong-un is in many ways operating under a Chinese umbrella, and he's doing what he wants to do. China may lightly scold him in public, but behind the scenes, they are happy. Whenever North Korea acts up, and look, I know all of the problems, the potential problems of North Korean refugees flooding China. He could be a serious headache for China too. I get it. But at the end of the day, what seems to trump that for China and for Russia is the fact, real simple, folks, that North Korea acting up and causing trouble is a headache for America. And China and Russia like that. Whenever there's a headache for the United States, China and Russia are happy about that. North Korea has been a major headache for the United States for decades. So China and Russia are saying, unless this really affects us in a major way, let's let the Kim regime keep doing what it's done for decades. being crazy there on the Korean Peninsula and firing ballistic missiles and threatening nuclear annihilation. But China and Russia say, as long as it doesn't affect us, we'll let them keep doing it. Why? Because it does affect the United States and causes major headaches for our main global rival, the United States. So will North Korea get involved in the China-Taiwan? I would think not. In that case, I would think China would do that solo and take care of that on their own. But always watch what North Korea is doing in the Middle East as well. Iran's ballistic missile technology, nuclear technology as well. North Korea has worked with them over the years on that nuclear program. There have been Iranian scientists present at these North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile tests, and they weren't there for the scenery. They were there to observe what was happening. So North Korea, Iran, very rosy relationship. North Korea will not be silent for long. They've been relatively quiet over the past few months, but Kim Jong-un wants attention, and that's also a hot spot to watch in 2022 that we haven't talked about a lot lately. But North Korea, that threat still very much alive, sadly. Okay, more questions. Let's see. Pardon me as I just look at the questions here. Here's a good one by Dove. Will Iran and Israel, Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan all happen at the same time? Oof, could you imagine? Talk about people screaming for peace and safety. As the Bible says, if that all happened at once. On the timeline, and again, it's tough to say, anything could happen, but on the timeline, you would think if these things, God forbid, break out, Russia and Ukraine seems to be the first one in terms of, look, Russia right now, 100,000 Russian troops massed on Russia's border with Ukraine. U.S. officials have been concerned about a pending invasion. Biden and Putin, 2 meetings in the past month. NATO meeting and U.S. and European officials meeting, trying to come up with some kind of coordinated strategy. So Russia, Ukraine seems to be the first on the burner. China, Taiwan, I continue to say the Beijing Olympics. That is the great date to watch, I guess you would say, beginning, I think, February 4th in China. China's not going to do anything before those Olympics when they're going to have the attention of the world. The eyes of the world will be on China for those Olympic Games. After those Olympics, all bets are off. Iran and Israel, alongside Russia and Ukraine, could be the most likely. Honestly, that could look at what we're seeing now in the Middle East with U.S. forces being targeted. It's a tinderbox. The slightest, seemingly slightest provocation could spark a major regional war between Iran and Israel. So that is evergreen, as they say. Iran, Israel could break out any day. Russia, Ukraine looks, if it's going to happen, and we sure hope it doesn't, that would look more imminent than China, Taiwan. But after the Olympics, I expect China to ramp up the rhetoric big time once again against Taiwan. And China's also been threatening the United States over our support of Taiwan. So folks, keep all of this in prayer. We need it right now. It is a world gone mad, but we knew it would be like this. The Bible's very clear about it. And we didn't get into the prophetic as much as I wanted to today. We had more geostrategic things to discuss. But keep all of this in prayer. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, of course. Pray for, no matter where you are, pray for the safety of those U.S. troops there in Syria and Iraq. As an American, I'd appreciate if you could do that wherever you are around the world. And hey, God Almighty still sits on the throne. Don't fret. Don't get worried. Don't get anxious. God still sits on the throne. He will never leave you or forsake you. He will work all things together for the good of those who love him. Key point there, those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And if you lean on him, he will make your paths straight. When the storms come, you can look forward with confidence and peace and say, it's going to be okay because Jesus is in the boat with me. Remember that. Don't lose heart. Until tomorrow, thanks so much for joining us. God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.